Let me share my screen. Um, okay. Well, thanks for having us give this talk. There are a lot of things that I've been asked to speak on for which I actually can claim more expertise than how to write specific aims. And the only real credentials that I bring to this talk involve having served for, several years on the NINDS NSDK study section and a bunch of other study sections, um, and just having read over time many specific games pages. So I'm familiar with a range of what folks do, and I've seen positive and negative reactions to what folks do from other reviewers. So I've also written a few specific games pages for grants myself over the years, some of which got good reviews and were funded, and others that not so much so. So I don't know how much of a credential that is. Um, uh, the I don't have any disclosures um, for this talk. Uh, this should be one of the shorter talks, I think one of the shorter webinars in this series, and so there's more time to talk about things at the end. But we're going to talk about what makes the specific games page so important. I think that's really the key. I think everyone would agree on that, and I don't think it can be overemphasized. We'll talk a little bit about why the specific games page is important. We'll talk a little bit about what I think are some of the hardest parts about writing a good specific games page. There are a lot of things that make a page good, and a lot of things that make it hard. Most of them are obvious, but some of them are going to be project specific. So there's not a lot I can tell each one of you to help your specific games page. But that said, that there are a number of common stylistic elements that are hard to achieve, but really improve a page. Then I will suggest a proposed structure or template for the page, and that's something upon which there's no agreement. But I'll pitch you my preferred style and know that it's just that. It's just my preferred style. Then we'll use the balance of the time to discuss your questions and concerns. Like I said, there's a link to a PDF at the end with some examples from many years ago for people who offered to give their specific games page for this purpose. So the specific games page is your big chance to make an elevator pitch for the grant that you're proposing. And there are at least 3 really good reasons why this is so important. Number one is that there's a lot of people who are going to read only this. And that's because of how the review process works. Your grant's going to go to a review panel of maybe 20 folks or more, all of whom will ultimately vote a score for your application. 2 or more of those will be assigned as a primary and secondary reviewer, and then there may be some tertiary and statistical reviewers assigned, and the primary and secondary reviewers and probably the other assigned reviewers will pretty reliably read your entire grant from snout to tail. They're going to read it thoroughly, they're going to understand it, you hope, and they may or may not read your appendices, but they'll read your grant application. But the other 15 plus people won't read it, right? They're going to hear about the grant application in a presentation by the primary and secondary reviewers. The additional reviewers will add some comments. Then there will be a discussion among the whole panel. And typically during that presentation, the other members of the committee are going to bring up your application on their computer screen or their tablet, or maybe they'll have it printed out, and they'll start browsing it, but probably for the first time. And since they were assigned other grant applications, that's what they read in preparation for the meeting. So the things that they're going to look at is mostly your specific games page. And that moment is your chance in that room to sell those other 15 people on your idea, independently of what the reviewers have said. And that might be all they look at. They may skim some other elements. Different folks do different things. Some might flip to your figures or your methods too, but probably everyone's going to look at your specific games page for the first time right there. And like I said, although the assigned reviewers may be the only ones to read the application, everybody on the panel votes. And no one's vote counts more than anyone else's vote. So your specific games page is your grant to the majority of the review panel. So this is your elevator pitch. It's your only chance to talk to most of the reviewers. The next most important reason why the specific games page is important is related to what this guy says. Now, many years ago, I wouldn't have had to, say who this is. Everyone would have recognized this as Will Rogers. But nowadays, I have to tell people, I'm old. And Will Rogers is famous for saying a lot of different things. But one of the things that he is really famous for saying is that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And there's no question that that's true about your specific games page as well. Independent of all the folks who read only your specific games page, even your reviewers, who you really have to sell to, are going to read your specific games page first. And what we now know about how, this isn't just homespun wisdom from Will Rogers, we know from cognitive science that, he was absolutely right, and that this is actually how people think. Most people make their decisions in a fast-thinking, snap judgment kind of way. They read something quickly, they look at it, they form an opinion, and then they spend whatever additional time available on the matter trying to rationalize and justify the decision that they've already made. So your chance to get a reviewer hooked, interested, engaged, excited about your project comes from this initial look at the specific games page. If you get them interested, they're going to spend the rest of the time reading your application looking for reasons to like it and support it. If, on their first glance of your specific games page, they're disinterested, bored, confused, then they're going to read the rest of your grant application looking for reasons to not approve it or to score it badly, I should say. So there's no question that first impressions is the hook and it's the key. The third reason that a specific games page is really important in my mind is that it's sort of the page that people read the most often. And what I mean by that is that what I do as a reviewer, and I think a lot of others do as well, is use the specific games page sort of as a map for the 12 pages that follow. So as you're getting into the 12 pages of the grant, which are dense and detailed and data-laden and methodologically complex, when you get sort of lost, you say to yourself, what were they even trying to do in the first place? What are they even trying to do here? And so I go back to the specific games page to try to reorient and figure out and remind myself exactly what the applicant's saying and how it relates to the question being answered. So if you can provide that map in your specific games page, if you can make it clear there how everything else that you're going to unpack in your pages relates to your goal and to your purpose, then the reviewer can sort of repeatedly understand that and get back to it and know what it is that you're trying to get them to understand. So additionally, the reviewer is also going to go back to your specific games page when they go to fill out the review on the summary statement form. So there's a few questions that they have to answer on what is the significance, what is the innovation, and to the extent that you can give them a clear, concise statement that explicitly answers that scoring criteria for them, anywhere in your grant application actually, but especially good on the specific games page, you're making it easy for them to give a more positive review. If they can find the statement, this is innovative because, then they can just maybe not exactly cut and paste that into the review, but they can paraphrase it. They can easily find what it is that they need to put in their review to explain why it's innovative. You don't want them to have to try to figure out why it's innovative. One thing that you should always be trying to do on your specific games page and throughout the application is to make life easier for your reviewer. A happier reviewer is more likely to give you a happy score. So if that's about why it's important, let's talk a little bit about what's so hard about writing a good specific games page. You probably know why it's hard because you've been trying it already, but obviously, given what I just said about how important it is, it's clear what's hard, right? You've got just one page to summarize your whole project and clearly explain all that complexity and nuance that you've worked out for the past, 6 to 12 months or longer. One page to get it right, get it clear, get it detailed, and, get it exciting and everything else that we just talked about. So that's, incredibly hard by itself. Equally obvious is that the hardest parts are all going to be project specific and are going to differ for each of you. So that's just inherently hard, and I can't tell you how to do that. But what I can do is emphasize some general concepts that are specifically hard to do when writing. And by recognizing these concepts and making them explicit, the hope is that you'll tackle them head on rather than just sort of subconsciously ignoring them because they're hard. So I want to talk about the narrative of this specific games page and then provide some observations on focus. So with regard to the narrative, a narrative is by definition a spoken or written account of connected events, and that's a story. And your specific games page really should be a story. It should flow, and it should take the reader on a sort of a journey that will get them excited and take them to a resolution where they want to fund your grant to learn how it ends. And it's the story that gets the reviewer engaged. So that may sound a little different from what others have told you, and you may say, you know, gosh, that's not what I've heard. I've heard that the specific games page is supposed to be like an elevator pitch, but really that's exactly the same thing. So the elevator pitch is really a story also. And this is the classic elevator pitch sentence structure that you'll find in any Business 101 class or text. And the sentence structure says, you know, for a certain customer who has a certain need, I've got this product in this category that has some great purpose, unlike anything you have now. And that's really a story too. You've got a main character, the target customer, and the target customer has a problem, a crisis, and lo and behold, a hero comes in, a product that has certain powers and abilities that are going to save the day, save the world, vanquish the competition, and save the target customer so that she can live happily ever after. So, you know, it's all a story, and you can think about it in a pitch format, or you can also think about it in sort of the classical sense of a narrative arc. So if you've ever taken a creative writing class or even just are a purveyor of popular fiction and movies, then you know you've seen this pattern, which is how almost all stories work, with the exception of David Lynch movies and Kurt Vonnegut novels and Samuel Beckett plays. But you know, mostly it starts with an exposition that sets the scene, and something goes wrong, and there's a complication, and the complication gets worse and worse, finally reaching a dramatic crisis, and which the hero somehow overcomes, leading to a resolution of the problem and usually a newer and better world. So this can really map out directly to what you can write on a specific games page. So on the specific games page, you're going to start out with some background. Here's what the problem or disease is. And then there's a specific challenge. You know, if we could only know this biomarker or that biological mechanism or treat this aspect, then we'd be able to make a big difference. And that leads to a overarching goal of the project, which is the crisis. And then there's, you know, a hero that comes in, and you're the one who's going to come in and you know, save the day with these specific aims. And you're going to vanquish the problem and lead to an impact. And that's going to be an innovation in patient care where wonderful things will happen for all these people that were suffering before. So that's the story you want to tell. And we'll get back to this when we're talking about structure. Then I do want to talk a little bit more about focus as well, because I think this can even be harder to get right. Of course, you know, some parts of focus are easy. The specific games page focuses on the specific games. And if this blue guy in this picture represents the specific game statements themselves in your application, then it's not hard to tell here that he's not in focus. If you invest your time and energy wordsmithing to be explicit and precise and crystal clear, to eliminate ambiguity, to remove barriers to understanding, then you'll bring the aims into focus themselves. And I think that everyone would agree with that and would find that part pretty doable. That's not the hardest part of focus. The hardest part of focus is that the aims themselves are not the only part that has to be in focus. And so there's also the big picture, right? The impact, and the impact has to not only be there, but you have to have it sell with enough granularity that people can really see it and believe it. And then there also has to be a backstory. There has to be just enough methodological detail so that people can start to trust that you're going to be able to accomplish this even on this very, very limited page. So ultimately, you need to have every part of this page be sort of in focus from the statement of the problem to your solution, your aims, and your impact. And nothing on the page is a gimme. To make an analogy to photography, you're creating a depth of field by carefully sort of balancing your lighting, your shutter speed, and your choice of film and all of your resources. And the aims themselves are the center of the focus, but people have to be able to clearly understand the stuff around it as well. And that's really challenging, and it requires writing and rewriting as much as is needed. I would argue that this is the one page of your grant application that you need to share with others, with colleagues and friends, folks who work in your area and those who don't, because the panel won't be all subspecialists in your topic. It wouldn't hurt to have friends and families who are lay read this as well. This is just one page that you want to continue to revise so it's just as good as you can get it. And really you can't do that too often. So now I'm going to suggest a specific structure for your specific aims page. And a lot of what I told you so far is subjective, but this part of the talk is really purely a matter of opinion. So what I said before is subjective, this is really subjective. This is what I do. If you look online, you can find a bunch of other templates and ideas. I think that this is pretty similar to the kind of things you'll find, but everybody has their own preferences. There's no single right structure. So this, if you don't do it exactly this way, you're certainly not wrong. But roughly speaking, this is the structure that I suggest for a specific aims page. And it really follows that basic structure for an essay that you were taught like in middle school or high school. It's, an introduction that's an upside down triangle, a thesis statement, and then a body, usually in 3 parts, and then a conclusion. The introduction starts broadly and then narrows down to become more and more focused to your topic. And I suggest using about a quarter of the page for that. Then there's an extended thesis statement, and that's your idea, your goal, your purpose. And this is probably a quarter of the page or a little less. And it should also talk about you in that and why you're the right solution. And then the body is the actual specific aims themselves. So maybe another quarter or a third of the page. And then the rest of the page is the conclusion triangle that builds from your specific focus to the broader impact that you're going to have. Oops, and I meant to be typing these as I spoke on that. So that's really what I want to argue about for this. Just to review that the specific aims page is really important. It's critical. It's really hard. It should tell a story, have a wide focus, and consider using a template to make sure that you have all of your pieces. And with that, I will hand it over to Jordan.
Thank you. So I'm bringing up a perspective of a biostatistician to this. So most of my experience with looking at specific aims pages comes from either ones that I've been involved in writing the statistics for, or have been a reviewer looking at grants. And I will say, let me see if I can you advance the slides? I don't think I can. Okay, so a lot of times, and things are obviously in flux right now, but at NIH, but a lot of times the statistical reviewer might be asked to simply look at or focus on the approach, and so may just be scoring mostly the approach. Not always the case, but in some cases, especially if you're like the secondary or or third statistical reviewer. You might be just asked to look at the approach. And so you're really looking at, as Robert mentioned, you're looking at the specific aims page as kind of a roadmap to the application. You really, I think having, you know, that first understanding of what it is that you're trying to do in a nutshell, what's your design. I might not understand all of the science, but I'm going to understand at least what you're telling me or explaining to me is the significance of the science. And then I'm going to say, okay, this is the kind of design you're focusing on. And what I'm looking for when I'm reading the specific aims page is to make sure there's a consistency between what you think you're looking at or objectives are and what the statistical analysis is, because believe it or not, there can be a lot of inconsistencies there. That's a bit of a red flag. So next slide. So the first things first is really, looking at it to understand what's your research question. And so the specific aims, in my mind, no, there's different ways of doing this, but I think that the specific aims should be stated in terms of the scientific hypothesis, not necessarily the statistical hypothesis. And those are sometimes the same thing, but usually they're framed a little differently. And so as you're doing that, you want to be very, very specific. It's okay to state what your overarching hypothesis is for your body of research, but this is the page where you want to clearly state for this proposal what you are testing, what you are estimating, what your objectives are. And you want to state it in a way that it can be understood in the form of a testable hypothesis. So you want to clearly state what is the hypothesis population, what are you comparing, and what are you measuring? So what is your response variable and at what time point? These are some of the things that it doesn't take a lot of words to make this clear, but a lot of people don't take the time to do this well, and it can cause confusion. So the more clear you can be, the better. In terms of what you're measuring, you want to be specific here. And I know every field has its own jargon and in technical terms, but be mindful that not everybody on your reviewer panel is going to be familiar with that jargon. So you want to define things and define it succinctly so that anybody approaching it can kind of understand. So when you say, oh, I want to slow the decline of Parkinson's disease, or I want to prove that my treatment is neuroprotective, what is it that you're measuring? How are you measuring that? Because that could mean very many things. And in another one is, functional independence. What does that mean in terms of a measurement? It can be measured in different ways. So just be succinct about how you're measuring it, and then if you're dichotomizing that measure, like what your cut point is for success. So that will be very helpful for a statistical reviewer to understand the measurement. Consistency between the aims and the analysis is the other thing that I spend a lot of time kind of trying to make sure is happening. And usually if you're doing like a big phase 3 trial, a confirmatory trial, that's usually pretty easy. The aims are usually written in a way that is consistent with the analysis. Not always, but it's easier. Where it gets harder is for some of the earlier phase trials, especially pilot trials, especially phase 2 trials. Any time when you're in this framework of kind of wanting to begin to look at some signal of efficacy, but not particularly having the power to do it, you want to make sure that your aims are written in a way that reflect what you're doing and what your go, no go criteria are. So I'm just going to give you an example of, like, if I were to read an aim that says to determine whether treatment A is as good as treatment B, in my mind, that's a non-inferiority hypothesis. Now, some people might think that's just a simple two-group comparison, but not in my mind, not the way that's written. And then an example of an aim that is very common is something where someone might say, I want to demonstrate safety of my drug. It's vague. It's not something you can test easily. So you want to clearly define, what's your primary safety outcome? How are you, what are you comparing that to? And is it realistic? So the more specific you can get on that, the better. If you don't have a consistency between the aims page and the statistician, it kind of implies that you don't have a very good correlation or collaboration with that statistician. So it can be kind of a little bit concerning. Another thing is, and as Robert mentioned, the specific aims page is something you want to give to lots of people to kind of vet and make sure that it has, makes sense to everyone. And so that often means that you're making changes to that page up until kind of the very last minute. Just make sure that you give that to the statistician or you include them in that if you do update it, because things can creep in wordings that don't, it might not be obvious to you, but it might be very obvious to the statistician. Oh, hey, there's now an inconsistency that we need to make sure gets straightened out. So just allow time for that. If you are changing your aims at the last minute, allow some time for your statistician to update anything that needs to be updated in the analysis section. Sometimes things that happen like this can be things like, oh, all of a sudden you've decided that, oh, I don't really want to follow people for 6 months. I really just want to follow them for 3 months, or vice versa. So maybe there's a change to the timing of when you're collecting something. It's a minor thing, perhaps, but it gets propagated into other sections that need to get updated. So just be aware of changes that need to be shared. And obviously, the best science takes time and takes feedback from different people, so these things happen. But if you can communicate them to the statistician, that will help minimize inconsistencies. Is there another slide? Oh yes, exploratory aims. So I would say that a lot of times people like to structure your specific aims page as kind of, you have like your first aim, your second aim, and then the third one is this exploratory aim. Lots of opinions about whether to include an exploratory aim or not. There's definitely pros or cons, but just be aware that the way I was taught is that all aims should have a power analysis and an analysis plan associated with them. Now, not everybody does it that way, and not everyone is taught that way, but if you have a reviewer that comes from that framework, then naturally an exploratory aim is not going to have the type of power that your first aim would have, right? So you're in some sense setting yourself up for potentially, some comments about that. Now, whether those comments would be deemed anything other than minor, I don't know, but I think it's in my mind, and I've definitely seen enough pages now that do that third exploratory aim, but in my mind, it's nice to maybe leave it off for that reason. But there's different styles of doing it, and I certainly recognize that when I'm reviewing things. I think that's my last slide. Was there another one?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you both, Jordan and Rob. That was excellent. While people are putting questions in the chat, I just wanted to add that my introduction, that Dr. Jordan Elm is a biostatistician and professor of at MUSC College of Medicine in South Carolina. She's an expert in clinical trial design, neurology, and neuroscience networks, including PI of the StrokeNet Data Management Center. So if people are still waiting on their questions, I'm going to ask a logistical question. How many pages should the specific aims consist of? Maximum, minimum
Just one
range?
page.
One.
It's still just one page, right? Has it changed?
Okay, and are there specific like spacing or font, use of chart diagrams, anything that you can comment on?
Check the rules. So the the applications have the rules. Generally, it's 11 point sans serif font. You can have the single spaced. I think sometimes it's worth giving a little white space and separating your paragraphs with an extra half line just for the visual benefits of it. You can do boxes around paragraphs. We do have some examples that Megan just put the link to that people gave us many years ago for this talk that you can take a look at. But generally it's the same rules as the rest of the grant application, and you should think about judicious use of white space to help make it more readable, understanding that the space is really valuable and you want to be very careful about giving up space, but just crowding things in just to crowd things in isn't a good idea either. Jordan, what?
And I agree with that. And I think just given what you have to cover in this one page, you probably won't have room for a figure. But it may depend on your application. A lot of times when people include figures, they tend to wrap text, around the figure, and I find that harder to read. As a reviewer, I think it would be nice to have that page in particular as clean as possible. Some might avoid figures for that reason.
That's great. As a reviewer, what questions do you generally ask yourself, and what are common topics that come up during the review?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of shared mine, which is mostly the two big ones being, is this significant, and is the approach rigorous? So those are the two things that I look at.
Yeah, what are they really doing here and why? I mean, if you read the specific aims page and you're still, after reading the page, still struggling to figure out exactly what it is that they're comparing and exactly who they're studying, then that's a problem.
Okay, great. And we know there are certain questions that are basically not going to go forward. So one would be, well, you can give me better examples, but I'm just thinking about an underpowered efficacy study is a non sequitur, and it's not going to go forward. Can you think of other examples?
I think there's a lot of examples. I mean, I think of things where people have a really interesting question, a really interesting problem, and then the aims don't really seem to address them, right? The aims are what they can do. So this is the data that we have available, but the data that they have available doesn't really show it. It doesn't explain why it would move the needle anywhere on the problem that they're talking about in the first place.
Yeah, I would also say
That's
maybe
great.
something that has too many aims or too many questions attached to it. It just doesn't look very focused. It looks like you're fishing for finding something. So being as clear on what you're trying to do as possible is good.
Uh-huh. And in terms of fishing expedition, how many aims appear to be too much? Or too many?
Robert, I know you and I probably differ on this, but
we've talked about it previously, so I don't remember what you said. So I think that, you know, I don't think there should be more than three aims. I mean, I think three is the maximum. I don't think you need three aims. And in fact, I think Jordan and I sort of agree that, you know, because I usually do have an exploratory aim, which is really a throwaway aim, which is not really an aim, which was Jordan's point. And, you know, it can be a weakness because if the third aim is exploratory and that's not really a specific aim, it's just sort of, you know, other things you hope to learn along the way, then that really means that there's two aims, and that third aim, either someone's going to say, okay, it's a throwaway aim, I'm not going to ding them on it, like Jordan said, or they're going to take it real seriously and say, well, that third aim sucks, and I'm going to ding you on it because you claimed it was one of your aims. Um, so I think really two or three. I mean, one would be not enough. Four, I think, is pretty much always too many. And then the follow up to that is that if you put in under each aim hypothesis, you know, zero, hypothesis one, hypothesis two, then you're, you know, got to be really careful. So I generally discourage that because that's sort of a way of trying to squeeze. Usually it's a way that people are trying to squeeze in additional aims, knowing that they can only have three, and that defeats the whole purpose. So I think that there are times when that is appropriate. Like I said, this all depends on your specific thing. But throwing in a bunch of hypotheses under an aim is also usually more risky than it is beneficial.
Thank you. These are excellent points. Now I see Marcus has a question.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
yes.
Yeah, so thank you for doing this. It was awesome. The question I have is, as a reviewer in a study section, so what kind of innovation, do you like to see in a specific aims? Because for us who are studying, there are kind of many approaches, many angles we can go. So can you expand a little further on that?
I mean, I can take that, but my perspective might be different than Robert's. I would say that as far as innovation goes, it's one of the review criteria. In my opinion, um, I mean, I think we like to be innovative, but we don't want to be innovative at the cost of the science. So we don't want to focus so much on being innovative that we are maybe not doing the best science. So in my mind, it's more of a yes, it can be many things, right? It's really what it could be. It could be your design. I mean, that's one thing, or it could be the product you're testing. It could be something about your process. I feel like it could really be anything as long as you've kind of got something there. But that's my take, Robert. I don't know about yours.
Yeah, no, it's one of the ones that one of those damned if you do, damned if you don'ts that we struggle with. And I have a cartoon that I use in another talk where somebody goes, you know, your idea is really innovative, but nobody's ever done it before. Um, and you know, so it, especially when you get to so there's a couple approaches, but when you get to methodology, I mean, it should be the right method to answer the question that you want to answer. And if it's a new method because nobody's had a best way of doing it before, and this is a new idea of how to do it, I think that's great. But I mean, I don't think you want to use a new method just because it's new and more innovative if it's really what you want to study is best answered by a traditional method. In my mind, what I've always tried to do is say, innovative is a plus, but really what needs to be innovative is the question and the answer. So I don't really want to fund your project if it's answering something that we already know that's been shown a dozen times before, and you just want to show it, again with some trivial variation. To my mind, that's why it's a scoring criteria, not the methodology. And if you do the methodology, then you just have to make sure that you can convince people that you have the ability to do it. And it's not so innovative that, the reason that nobody's done it before is because 100 people have tried and everybody's failed. And you're going to, be the 101st person to try this innovative method that everybody knows doesn't work.
I hope other people will have questions. In the meantime, I'm going to ask another one. When is it appropriate and where is it appropriate to put go, no-go criteria into your grant?
I would think that you would, phase 2 trials are where you most commonly see them. It's because the phase 2 questions are often a little less direct. And so it's nice to have a very clear go, no go rule. Those are usually statistically defined, but you would probably want to state that directly in your specific aims page.
Yeah, so usually it's a requirement of a notice of grant of a notice of funding opportunity, and it's in the phase 2 space. Sometimes phase 1 to phase 2, but you know, us in our clinical trial space, we're usually talking about phase 2 to phase 3. And I think that the background is that traditionally before we had an emphasis on having go no go rules, everybody who did a phase 2 wanted to move on to a phase 3 in that project, sort of no matter what their phase 2 showed, right?
Yeah.
Everybody interpreted in the favorable light, and if it showed that it really shouldn't go on, they said, oh, well, it was just because of this one, thing that we did different. Really, this is favorable. And so I think, requiring people to state exactly what it is supposed to help you design a phase 2 trial that really informs what it is that you really need to know to decide whether it was worth going into a phase 3. And rather than just doing a phase 2 as some sort of obligatory stepping stone, which doesn't really help in drug development or therapeutic development.
I know a lot of our trainees are doing pilot trials. How do you talk about the next stage after the pilot trial in the specific aims, or do you leave that for a different part of the grant?
I think you could definitely talk about it, and it goes in maybe the bottom paragraph, either right above the aims as your kind of overarching hypothesis, where you then lead into what you're currently doing, or as a wrap-up statement at the bottom of the page. I would think kind of like, if this is successful, kind of what the next step would be. That's where I would typically think you might put it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think in the pilot space, there definitely should be reference to it, right? Because the whole reason that you're doing the pilot is to learn something that will tell you what you're going to do next. And if it's not in there, the whole idea that it would be obvious to the reader, I mean, that's a major uh, that's a minefield right there, right? I mean,
Yeah.
anything that should be obvious to the reader, and you just say, well, it'll just be obvious to the reader, is a pitfall.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, a couple of the students were in the more advanced track. How do you develop an adaptive trial in the specific aims? Set the groundwork.
So I think again, it's just stating so every adaptive trial has specific things that you are making decisions on. So whatever those decisions are, um, it might just be one decision at the end, and that would be your specific aim, would be what that decision rule is. But you could describe that you are doing this in an adaptive way, and that it absolutely would be helpful to lay out your specific aims page to indicate that this is an adaptive design. You can do that either kind of like in the lead-in paragraph just before the aims would probably be where I would include that. Maybe not in the aim itself.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in my model of a story, like I said, it's the paragraph before the aims is how you as the hero are going to come in with this study that is the tool that's going to, solve everything, and it's part of the tool, right? So, because I have this adaptive approach, I'm going to be able to answer the question. This is how I'm going to answer the question in these aims. So I think and really adaptive trials aren't first of all, it's a very broad term, covering a lot of different methodologies, and you don't want to do an adaptive trial as a goal or an end in itself. It's not, an adaptive trial isn't an aim, or a trial being adaptive isn't an aim. It's the right, it was the thing that you chose out of your toolbox, which was the right tool for the question that you wanted to answer. Because I didn't, there were certain assumptions we needed to make going into this that we don't know. We want an adaptive trial that allows us to adjust to these things, where these assumptions can be led by the data as it's developing. And there are things that we've occasionally done where where we've made the outcome of the pilot trial a posterior probability of a certain phase 3 trial being positive, right? So if we show this, what's the probability that these will give priors for the phase 3 that would end up being a useful phase 3. So there are some other ways of integrating that. I think that there's ups and downs to that.
How do you balance having aims that are related but yet independently achievable?
I think that's the most common scenario, is having aims that are related, because your data is collected on the same patient, so you're going to have some correlation between outcomes.
I guess what I mean is my understanding is you don't want to write like your aim 2 that it depends on the success of your aim 1, correct?
Yeah. Well, in some sense, that being in the clinical trial framework, that helps you here, because you're usually, unless you have some kind of staged trial, you're usually collecting all the data and then analyzing it all at the end. So it's a little bit less than different than being kind of in the basic science framework, where this experiment the results of that would definitely change what you do next. So for ours, we usually ask for funding for a given clinical trial at once. So the only thing would be if you had kind of a seamless design, or something where you had 2 stages and you don't proceed to the second stage. And that is what it is. I think people understand that's a risk.
Yeah, I think that, so we've all heard the hard and fast rule that, the aims can't be dependent on each other. I think that that's overstated as a hard and fast rule. And I think, like Jordan said, I mean, in trials, there's almost always some dependence. Whether if the first aim is efficacy and the second aim is safety, and there's no efficacy, people really aren't probably not going to care much about the safety. I mean, there are situations where it still might be useful to know the safety, but so things don't have to be entirely independent. What I think you want to realize is that it just creates that risk, right? If aim 1 is to identify a cohort of patients where 2 things are coexisting, and then aim 2 is to take that cohort that we're hoping to discover and do a bunch of extra tests on them. That's not forbidden. It's just really risky. It's just like a basic science study that says, I'm going to do this after having proven this in the first aim.
And I think some examples of where it might go wrong would be like if you had your first aim was something like to show that it's feasible to do this thing that I want to test, right? And if you go into it saying, I don't even know if it's feasible, and I'm going to ask for money to do the next step, that might, for me as a reviewer, kind of say, well, why don't you just do the feasibility part on its own? That might be one consideration. But that being said, those things sometimes do get funded.
Yeah, and you can, a contingency section in the 12 pages that explains what you're going to do if something, went very different than what you expected and how you're going to pivot, is also an opportunity. I mean, that's a way of potentially dealing with that.
We have a question in the chat, which is, does what you said about exploratory outcomes apply also to future aims and directions?
That's a good question. I would say that no, because future aims and directions is more meant to be a general statement to guide the reviewer onto kind of what you're thinking of as big picture research profile. And it's not actually a specific aim that you're asking for funding for.
Yeah, I think that could be, I think that can be an alternative to making the exploratory aim that might be safer from, the criticisms that Jordan talked about. The reason to do it in an exploratory aim is sometimes to elevate its importance, though, and I mean the reason that I have it is usually because there's going to be some reviewer who says, I don't understand why they just didn't do, X, Y, or Z, or they didn't look at this, and it's because you don't, you thought about that, you wanted to do that, you think it's important, but you're not, you don't have the power to do that. So you're going to learn about it. You're going to get information that's going to be really informative, but it's not going to be sufficient to prove that aim. But it is a place to be able to explain that, yes, you agree with the reviewer that that's important and useful and something that you're going to learn about. But it has that risk. But I think you can perhaps do that by putting in future aims and directions. Depends on how specific and vague you want to be about those additional questions.
And future aims and directions kind of also speaks to the significance usually, I think, as well. So that's, I think, fairly important to include.
Yeah, but I do tend to think that the future aims and directions are what you're going to do as an outcome of this, grant, as opposed to what you're going to do in the grant. Whereas the exploratory aim moves it a little bit more and says, well, these are things that we're going to analyze as part of our plan. We're just not going to be able to definitively answer them. So it's a subtle difference, but it's, that's sort of where you try to draw the fuzzy line between those two.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. I think with that, we can end right on time. So we appreciate Robert and Jordan, you presenting, and Robin as well. Thank you to everyone who attended. You can grab the link in the chat for our evaluation survey. Our next webinar, which will be the last one in the 2025 CTMC series, is in 2 weeks and is on data science for clinical trials. Thank you and have a great weekend.